What do The Weeknd, Post Malone, and Drake have in common? They're pop icons, but before them, we had Nelly, and his run was legendary. And what makes it crazy is, he did it without being the most lyrical or the most gangster, he was the smartest. Because from the year 2000 to 2004, Nelly quietly had one of the most dominant runs in hip-hop history. You see, when you think of hip-hop in the 2000s, we got Lil Wayne and Young Money, Eminem 50 Cent's run with Aftermath, and Jay-Z and Kanye West doing their thing. But while they may have been dominating the streets, there was one side of hip-hop that they weren't really capitalizing on, the radio station. And when they did, because of their explicit lyrics, it would be a watered down version dubbed the radio mix. But you see, for Nelly, radio stations were his bread and butter with his radio rap. So while Eminem needed clean edits and 50 Cent couldn't be played uncensored, Nelly records sounded the same on the radio stations as it did on his albums. And that, my friends, was the key to his success. Being the fantasy of every high school chick, Nelly changed the concept of what it is to be successful in the early 2000s with his radio-friendly music, and we wouldn't know it then, but Nelly laid out the blueprints of how artists would market themselves to their fans and capitalize on a larger audience. But before we get any further, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Nelly didn't just wake up at Icon. The St. Louis legend story began, funny enough, in the state of Texas. Being born there, and after a few years he'll move to his mom's place in St. Louis, Missouri, and it would be in high school where young Nelly would show his signs of his early musical talents, forming the group Saint Lunatics with a few of his friends in 1993. However, while they were gaining some local buzz, this was the late 90s and hip-hop was being dominated by the groups and cliques of the East and West Coast. So if your group wasn't at the top of their game, they wouldn't stand out. That's why ultimately Nelly decided to become a solo act, even though he was still collab with the Saint Lunatics. That's why in 1999 he managed to get signed by Universal Records thanks to his fast rapping mixed with his catchy melodies. And after the success of his debut single Country Grammar peaking at number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100, the label thought they could make Nelly the face of the early Midwest scene. That at that time the idea was that the Midwest wasn't cool or viable for rap. You see, let me break it down for you. At the time, Chicago had Common, Detroit had Eminem, and Kansas City had Tech 9. But Universal Records believed Nelly could make the Midwest marketable. And just a year later, his debut album Country Grammar would debut at number 3 on the Billboard 200, selling 235,000 first week, with breakout singles like Country Grammar, Ride With Me, and EI. Now folks, this is no small feat. Back then, your debut album being at number 3 when people were still buying albums means you had a lot of motion going on. But more importantly, it meant that you were making money, which is why it would go on to be certified diamond. All of this from his debut album. You can see why Universal Records saw potential in him. And it was all thanks to radio stations. Radio spins meant mall speakers, award shows, and suburban houses, and that's where the real money was at. Country Grammar didn't just sell, it lived on radio stations for years. But while the record labels loved Nelly's commercial rap, this was still the early 2000s and hip-hop was coming out the golden era of gangster rap. That's why rap purists called Nelly soft. They said he wasn't a real rapper with his catchy bars, he lacked the lyrical talent, and some would say he was more pop than rap, discrediting his music as just radio play for a general audience for the ladies and more concerning white people, and not the core fan base of hip-hop. Which I can see why some people may see it as a bad thing, but with that mindset, hip-hop wouldn't be the juggernaut that it is today. Rappers like Eminem proved that ignoring a core portion of your fan base is just leaving room for someone else to capitalize and take over, which Nelly did. Ironically, I'm betting the same people that call Nelly soft were probably singing his hooks word for words in their shorty's ear. Nelly would go on to be a special guest at the 35th Super Bowl halftime show, which would only increase his exposure to a general audience outside of hip-hop. That's why his second studio album, Nellyville, released in 2002, debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200s. Working with artists like Kelly Rowland from Destiny's Child and Justin Timberlake, are you surprised that it sold 715,000 first week? And having hit singles like Dilemma and Hot in Here, both sharing sometimes being a number 1 on the Hot 100, this album would go on to be 6 times platinum just a year later. And what makes this run undeniable is that Nelly was doing this at the same time as Eminem, 50 Cent, and Jay-Z and still outselling them on the charts. So I don't want to hear the excuse that Nelly didn't have no competition. Then showing out at the Grammys, Dilemma going on to win Best Rap Song Collaboration, Hot in Here winning Best Rap Solo Performance. So with all these achievements, no wonder Nellyville is considered by critics the 14th best rap album of all time. Universal Records knew the Nelly experiment worked, especially when Hollywood started calling and he landed on the soundtrack of Walt Disney's Haunted Mansion.
But wait! There's more!
Because he also landed on the soundtrack of the blockbuster Bad Boys 2 with the track Shake Your Tail Feather, which went on to win a Grammy for Best Rap Performance by a Duo or Group. And all of this while he was still dominating on the radio wave. At this point, Nelly wasn't just a rapper, he was a household name. He was at the Super Bowl, the Grammys, and on movie soundtracks. So while other rappers were fighting over street validations, the radio stations needed Nelly at this point. They were even willing to look over the fact that he was facing a few controversies for what some people may call misogynistic bars, chalking it up as minor hurdles in his path of stardom. And with fame comes influence. That's why Nelly would be considered one of the faces of 2000s hip-hop fashion, embodying that Y2K style. He had it all, from the oversized jersey to his iconic band-aid on his cheek. Nelly was a public influencer before we even knew what that was, influencing what it was to look hip-hop. Let me explain. Nelly's style was iconic. When you think of hip-hop, depending on what era, you think of do-rags, fitted cap, baggy clothes, and most importantly, giant chain, which Nelly had it all. But by far, his biggest contribution was his impact on the white Air Force One's popularity. We all know that hip-hop culture and sneaker culture go hand in hand, from the early breakdancers, Run DMC and their Adidas, to Air Jordans being a status symbol in black culture. Because we all know someone that would tell you if you don't have no Jordans, you're broke. And Nelly and his Air Force Ones were about to change the game far before the black Air Force Ones became a danger signal. Being his favorite sneakers, he even named a track after them. And for the music video, Nelly had that Foot Locker bussin'. Nelly showed so much love to the sneakers that even Nike had to cut the check, and he wasn't even sponsored by them. But it doesn't take a rocket science to realize that Nike ultimately won that deal, cause till this day, with all that free promo, Air Force Ones are sold everywhere and associated with hip hop. By 2003, Nelly was no longer chasing the industry was chasing him, with brand deals, movie offers, and more radio time. It was that year that his relationship with current wife Ashanti began, and that year's Grammy. His love of sneakers led him to signing a one-year deal with Nike and even releasing his own sneakers, the Air Dirty. Then after that was over, he got another shoe deal with Reeboks, to then owning the iconic apple-bottom jeans brand. In the early 2000s, Nelly wasn't just selling music, he was selling a lifestyle, fashion, relationship, radio hits, and crossover appeal. It's fair to say that Nelly's catchy hooks mixed with his Missouri slang had put him at the top of his game. So much so that in 2004 he would perform at the Super Bowl again. Coming off that successful 2003, Nelly was feeling himself, which is the only reason why I can come up with as to why Nelly would drop 2 albums on the same day. I'm talking about the album Sweat and Suit, which would both reach the top of the billboards at 1 and 2 respectfully. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know another artist who dropped 2 albums on the same day and both reached the top of the billboard. Talk about being your biggest enemy. And these albums just increased his popularity, tapping into a new fan base thanks to his collab with country star Tim McGraw, which even led to him getting a television concert on NBC. Nelly was making history, but because his success looked so effortless, we often forget just how rare his run really was. However, while dropping these 2 albums at the height of his career showed how dominant Nelly was, he may have flown too close to the sun, cause after Sweet and Suit dropped on the same day with all that music, for the first time fans started saying, "I've heard too much Nelly." And while at first that was a good thing, like my dad used to say, everything in excess is a bad thing. You see, Sweat and Suit proved how big Nelly really was, but it also marked the moment where the culture started to move on. By the mid-2000s, the sound of hip-hop was starting to change again, and Nelly chose not to chase it. He already proved himself. But with that being said, Nelly was still a pop icon, and his influence shouldn't be looked over. We already saw how he changed the game and put the Midwest on the map. That Midwest slang, melodic rap, and crossover sound, you still hear it today. The rappers just look different, but I can promise you it all comes from that country grammar. So while everyone was so worried about being the toughest rappers, which led them to spitting some of the wildest bars, which yes, sounded great, were too explicit for public radio waves. waves. Nelly, on the other hand, kept it classy, saw through the noise, and that allowed him to carve out his own lane and became a Midwest icon. But there's two sides to a coin, and if you want to hear more about another rapper from the Midwest who changed the game, click this video on Eminem. Or if you wanted to hear about another rapper who dominated in the 2000s and built a foundation for this era of hip-hop, click the video on Lil Wayne on the screen. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. I'm out.